Okay, good evening, everybody. Ravi, thank you very much for joining again after 2 years, and it's great pleasure to have you here. I hope you have been having very productive interaction with Mamta Devi in Kolkata.
No, I haven't met the Chief Minister on this visit, but thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on and to speak to you and
Okay, most of the people who are on this program today, they all know about you, but still, for the sake of courtesy, I must really say a few things about you. In the young age, he's a veteran of CNN. He joined CNN in 2006. He helped launch CNN's program Connect the World in London 2009. And from 2011 to 2014, he was the senior producer of CNN's Sunday World Affairs program, Fareed Zakaria GPS. From 2014 to 2017, he was the CNN bureau chief in Delhi. Many of you might have seen him and at least listened to him. And he has been extensively covering India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and South Asia. Now, from 2014 to 2017, he was a bureau chief, and then 2018, he joined the foreign policy. And he was designated editor-chief in 2020. Until 2016, he was young global shaper at the World Economic Forum. In 2016, he was named Asia's 21 leader by Asia Society. Please don't unmute. Keep your mic on mute. Let me mute all of them, otherwise it will. He was named Asia 21 Young Leader by Asia Society in New York. His book, India Connected, How the Smartphone is Transforming World's Biggest Democracy, has had rave reviews. It has been very well received by people who know about India. Now, Ravi, as you are based in US, let me ask a question which must be on the mind of most Americans and also America's friends abroad. Who is going to be the next POTUS? Is American public ready to give another chance to President Biden, though he's already old as 82-year-old? Or has he please, please keep your mic on the mute. I don't know who is keeping it on. Now, is public prepared to give another chance to President Donald Trump, though he has been indicted twice and he is still facing several court cases, but still he's leading in the polls. He is far ahead of most of his rivals in the Republican Party. Or do you think there are so many of Indian Americans who have thrown their hat in the ring and they are also throwing abuses at each other? So I don't know whether any one of them has distinct chance or running as maybe running mate of one of the candidates. So over to you, Ravi.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining. It's great to see you all. For those of you who have your videos off, hello, good to see your names on the screen. So to answer your question, Ambassador, the polls suggest a mixed picture. The polls suggest that former President Donald Trump has a lead over current President Biden. I'll come to why those polls are difficult to interpret and maybe difficult to believe as well. But to answer your question about the Indian American candidates who are in the field, so this is Vivek Ramaswamy, who's a young upstart who comes from the private sector. And then there's Nikki Haley. Both of them are polling very badly right now. Nikki Haley is the third placed candidate in Republican polling, around about 11% right now. She is behind Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. And Ramaswamy is way behind in the 5 to 6% range. And all of them are way behind President Trump, who's in the 50% range. So it would be shocking to me if President Trump did not win the party's nomination. There's a little bit of a race between the nominating dates and when any of the legal processes against former President Trump may take place. Currently, according to the timeline on each of the cases against him, both criminal and civil, it is likely that the nominating procedures will happen before there is any resolution on any of the court cases. So it's highly likely then that we will face a Trump versus Biden rematch. The only thing that could upend that is if something happens to the health of either of these two candidates, or if something dramatic develops in the courts. I'm not expecting that, to be frank. So we're left then to, in a rematch between President Trump and Biden, which of them could win? The polls suggest that right now Trump has the edge. The reason why I wouldn't care too much for the polls at this stage is that a lot of the polls that are being conducted are essentially asking people for their confidence in President Biden, and historically, incumbent leaders have a lower confidence rating in the months leading up to an election. That usually tends to change in the days leading up to the election. And the reason there is that right now, voters are kind of deciding whether they're happy or unhappy with President Biden. The question changes in an election, an actual election in November of 2024. I think the question voters will be asking is, do we want 4 more years of Biden, or can we survive another 4 years of Trump? That framing is quite different. And once that framing of the question changes, I think the results might change as well. Who am I to predict what will happen? But I do think it's important for the world to consider what a second Trump term could mean for democracy, what it could mean for multilateralism, what it could mean for the rules-based liberal international order. All of those things are deeply worrying to me. I imagine they will be worrying to many Americans as well.
Let us move from US to US-India. The Prime Minister Modi, the first Prime Minister who had already interacted, dealt with 3 presidents, President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden. And luck will have it, he might be dealing with the 4th one next year. Now, many observers feel that if you take objective look at India-US relations, this is perhaps the best phase in last 75 years. I'm not giving a figure whether trade or defense cooperation or intelligence sharing or... Is this relationship just transactional, or is it strategic? Or how much of this warmth and bonhomie can be attributed to America's strained relations with China?
Yeah, you framed that question really well. I think part of the impetus for White House policymakers across several generations, as you pointed out, so going back 20 years, if you consider that American policymakers see in the longer term China as the most important threat to its primacy around the world. So once you make that assumption, which is the right assumption to make, you have to look at American foreign policy through that prism. And through that prism, India becomes very important. Becomes important not only as a strategic bulwark against China's expansionism in Asia, but also in as much as America can try and build a coalition of democracies, ostensibly to position them against the region's autocracies or less democratic countries. You said something very interesting when you said that, is this strategic? Is it transactional? What you didn't ask is whether this is about values. And I think there's a real understanding in Washington now that the US-India partnership is not really about values. I think this has become clearer over the last couple of years as the Biden administration has tried to talk about pitting democracies against autocracies. They're beginning to realize now that democracy is not a black and white thing. It's actually gray. And there are all kinds of potential partners around the world, whether it's India, whether it's Saudi Arabia, that may have a relationship with democracy that is a little bit different than American policymakers like to imagine as being the ideal state relationship with democracy. So for that reason, I would say the India-US relationship is more about strategy. It is more about interests. And there's a realism that has entered this relationship, which I think is actually good for both sides. And the reason why I say this is when there are stumbles, when there are humps along the way. So for example, when America got all of this intelligence that suggested India may have been involved in an assassination attempt of a pro-Khalistan activist in the United States, it doesn't derail the relationship, because the relationship isn't purely about values. It is actually a bigger relationship that is rooted in strategy and that is rooted in interests. So I see that as a good thing for both sides, in that they can be mature about the way in which their relationship develops, and they have a longer term plan. And I think that strategy and that trajectory is something that, as you say, has been continuing for the last 20 years. And I expect it to continue for many years to come, not only because the two are fairly aligned in how they see the world, but also because, again, the primary sort of motivating, shaping force in geopolitics today is US-China competition. And India, I think, will find a very interesting place within that competition to try and carve out areas of influence for itself, as it has been doing through minilateral alliances, through its presidency of the G20 and other instances.
Well, you will agree that India-US relations have reached a stage where they can agree to disagree. You have seen maturity, they can really see the differences. How much pressure was put in India to condemn Russian invasion of Ukraine? All kind of language used, they are wrong side of history, but India stood its gun. Same is the case about air defense system purchase from Russia. A lot of pressure was put. So they have realized the importance that you have to have some kind of, you can't agree on all the point, but you can agree on most of the point. And then G20 summit, even EM Jaisankar in USA during visit admitted publicly that US was very supportive of India's presidency. And the unanimous declaration which we got, it was also partly because of very helping hand from US. Now we refer to China. We saw the much awaited summit between President Biden and Xi Jinping on the sidelines of APEC in San Francisco. While nothing much happened, but at least 2 points were referred all the time: the restoration of military-to-military communication, and I think some trading about Venezuela, but nothing big ticket. But I personally feel Xi Jinping's statement that the planet is big enough for the two superpowers to succeed, and there is no option of turning back on each other, I think is very serious and symbolic message. China want to be treated equal. Two superpower, China is putting itself equal to the US. China also doesn't want to be to US to be insensitive to some of the issues which are sensitive to them. For example, Taiwan. They had discussed also earlier that how whole thing was derailed when Pelosi went there. So how do you see the US-China relations? There is some kind of thought, and for the world largest economy and second largest, there should be a thought that is good for the global economy and also for addressing so many other global commons. Over to you.
Yeah, that's a great point. So this meeting between Biden and Xi at Sunnyvale in San Francisco was really important for the world. To recap, the two agreed to resume military-to-military communication. It's crazy that that wasn't already the case. But anyway, they've agreed to resume those communications, which means that anytime there's, a threat of a collision on the high seas, the two can at least pick up the phone and speak to each other. Fentanyl, as you pointed out, is a drug that the United States is very worried about. China has been sending the precursor materials to Mexico, which is then producing it into fentanyl and then flooding the American market with this very, very dangerous drug. America really wanted to put an end to that so that, it can try and curb some of the opioid epidemic in America. But bigger picture, I agree with you that Xi Jinping's statement that the world is big enough for two superpowers is a good statement. It is heartening for the rest of the world. No one wants to see America and China fight. No one wants to see them fully decouple. That would be bad for global trade. It would be bad for other countries. However, it's very important to see Xi Jinping's statement in light of whether he made that statement from a position of strength or from a position of weakness. And I think it's very clear that he has made that statement from a position of relative weakness. China's economy has weakened over the last few years, partly because of its very strict zero COVID policy, partly because of a bloated real estate sector, partly because of an incredibly high debt to GDP ratio, almost 300% higher even than America, even though China is per capita a much poorer country than America is. It's essentially a middle income country that has fallen into what economists call a middle income trap. So Xi Jinping has a range of problems on his hands. When you add to that the fact that America's recent export controls on China, especially the chip restrictions, are beginning to bite, which Xi Jinping has begun to admit now openly for the first time. When you add all of that together, it becomes increasingly clear that China realizes that it made a mistake in being too bombastic over the last 4 or 5 years, and that it really requires a period of stability in US-China relations so that it can stabilize its economy, first and foremost. Now, the Americans know this, and it is no surprise then that the big news for me this week, this has completely flown under the radar, but there's a very powerful Select House China Committee in Washington, which is bipartisan. It is run by Mike Gallagher, a Republican congressperson, and Raja Krishnamurthy, a Democratic congressperson. And they have made a series of 150 recommendations, which essentially are calling for a soft decoupling from China and getting rid of some of the lower tariffs that were put in place decades ago when China was trying to join the WTO. Now, these recommendations may not be followed by Congress, but it's really important as a marker for how some of the most influential bipartisan China watchers in Washington are thinking about the most important relationship in the world. They see China as being in a moment of weakness, and they want to step on the pedal and make sure that they contain China, that China is unable to grow as fast as it wants to grow. They see the trend lines of China slowing, and they like it. They want to keep it that way. We can discuss this further, but a slowing China is also not great for the world. It is not good for Asia. It is not good for global trade.
But don't you think these attempts at decoupling US economy from China are also trying to do outcompete China have largely failed? This whole emphasis on de-risking or diversifying is indirect admission that these things are not working. What do you say?
Yeah, I think that they didn't quite work. I mean, for starters, the very idea of decoupling was crazy. The thought that the two biggest economies in the world can decouple, as in not have anything to do with each other, was a crazy idea. For those of you who don't know, this was an idea that was essentially cooked up by a man called Robert Lighthizer, who was the US trade representative under President Trump and had incredibly hawkish views about the state of US-China relations. He saw China as a mortal threat to the United States and really wanted to take dramatic measures to curtail China's growth. That's where the thesis and the intellectual history of decoupling came from. It was never going to work. The private sector hated the idea. I mean, if you think about the fact that America's biggest company, Apple, at the time, which has all of its supply chains and construction of iPhones in China, the thought of decoupling for the private sector is just crazy, especially given that they've spent the last 20 years, 25 years trying to do more business with China. So that didn't make sense. But also politically, it wasn't feasible because there were a lot of countries in Europe that didn't want to go along with a decoupling regime. So the term de-risking, which you used, is a term that was first deployed by Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the European Commission. And this was, I believe, at Davos in 2021. And after or 2022, after she used that term, it's become much more common to use it. The current USTR, Catherine Tai, has been using that phrase as well. And de-risking really is an idea that stems from the fear of the pandemic. When the pandemic took place, you have to understand how America felt. They suddenly realized we need lots and lots of masks. All the masks are made by the Chinese. Oh my God, what do we do? And so the theory then goes that America began to think about securing supply chains, nearshoring, friend shoring, ally shoring. You hear all these terms. The genesis was the pandemic and a realization that globalization had gone too far and America needed to try and make sure it could secure its supply chains. That's kind of where the de-risking theory comes from as well. But decoupling isn't over. If you look at this week's report from the Select China Committee, which again, it has flown under the radar and news organizations should be reporting much more on this. Decoupling isn't over. I think America may yet try to decouple in certain ways, especially in high tech, semiconductors, defense-related areas. They may try to cut China out of the global ecosystem. They've done some of that with high-end chips. And I think that's how they're beginning to see it. A little bit of decoupling, but a lot of de-risking.
Tell me what is going on in China. Their foreign minister went missing. Then their defense minister went missing. I don't know who is next. What's going inside China, according to you?
I mean, China's a black box. It's not very easy to understand what exactly is going on there. I actually met Li Shangfu, the Chinese defense minister, at the Shangri-La conference in Singapore last June, so just a few months ago. And then a few months later, he was gone. Qin Gang, who is the foreign minister, was very well known to many of us journalists in the United States because he was the Chinese ambassador to the US. I think in his case specifically, we know that there was an affair with someone in the United States. There was perhaps a child born through that affair. And I think some of that led to his removal, partly because they were scared that there could be influence over him, or people could sort of bribe him, as it were, or blackmail him. I think those were the fears around him. Li Shangfu, we don't really know what happened. It could be part of a larger anti-corruption drive. But I think if you zoom out and you look at the bigger picture, this isn't new. I mean, when Xi Jinping came to power more than a decade ago, he was very quick to remove anyone who was either seen to be corrupt or who could potentially become a rival. So Bo Xilai, who was this very big, well-known, famous provincial leader from Chongqing, there were anti-corruption charges placed against him, rightly or wrongly, we don't quite know, but he was removed. Xi Jinping has sort of kind of launched an anti-corruption drive for quite a while, in part because it's very popular. I think in as much as the Chinese people often get upset with the government and the amount of power the government has, Xi sees the removal of certain officials as a way to release the pressure valve of anger. So I think that's some of where this is coming from. But also, Xi Jinping believes in absolute power. So any potential threat to him, that person tends to go very quickly. Those are the bigger picture elements that I look to, but really, we're all just playing a guessing game when it comes to China.
Well, country associate with Indo-Pacific, Quad, AUKUS, they all try to say it very loud and clear that these groups are not against China. But China has been saying they are basically, essentially anti-China. Now, are there no ways of really trying to allay Chinese fears?
No, these are anti-China groups. Let's be clear. We might call it something else, but when you have something called AUKUS, which is Australia, UK, US, and they involve nuclear-powered submarines, what inference are you supposed to derive from it? When you have the Quad countries conduct maritime exercises, what inference do you expect China to draw from it? So I don't blame China for seeing these groups as anti-China alignments. That is, in fact, what they are, if not in name, then in purpose, in effect. I don't think any amount of reassurance will change Beijing's perception of these groups as anti-China. But I think what Beijing will do and has been doing is to try and build its own networks, its own alliances, and to use money to do that. So it's been doing that through the Belt and Road for the better part of a decade. It's been doing that through either the Asian Development Bank or now the Brics Plus enlargement and the Brics Development Bank. So China is trying to create its own version of a multilateral system where it can sit at the top. Now, China, of course, has done a lot of things that you could say are breaking the rules. It has engaged in debt trap diplomacy, for example, in the way in which it took over a key Sri Lankan port, the way it's taken over large tracts of land in parts of Asia, in Bhutan, or across Africa. You can criticize all of that, rightly so, but the Chinese criticism of the West is also fairly valid in that if you look at the IMF and the World Bank, these are institutions that have rules in place that they can only be run by an American or a European. And so China feels that despite all the clout it's won, despite the size of its economy, it isn't being given a say in the multilateral institutions that exist. So it wants to create that say. And that's kind of where this resentment is coming from. And frankly, India also is beginning to share some of those resentments, as you see from India's claims to try and join the UN Security Council. So I think there are many countries in the global south that share some sympathies with that Chinese perspective, even if they also criticize China for engaging in the kinds of practices that hurt them, whether it's, forcing them to take loans at certain rates, whether it's trying to corner the critical minerals market, or any of the other strong-arm tactics that China gets criticized for.
But China can also claim some diplomatic successes this year. They were behind rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's quite a big deal. And recently, just week back, they had invited Arab leaders to China about Hamas and Israel conflict. Do you think Chinese can be a mediator where the US has failed in bringing about some kind of peaceful resolution of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict?
So you're right. The Chinese bringing together of Saudi and Iran was a big deal. It was a real show of force. And it also shows China's connections with both Riyadh and Tehran. And that, by the way, worried America and forced it to accelerate its process of trying to normalize ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which in a strange way may have also accelerated Hamas's plans to upend those potential normalization deals and conduct the attacks on October 7th. I think, however, it's highly unlikely that China has leverage to try and secure any sort of deal between Hamas and Israel, or the Palestinian people and Israel. And that's primarily because China hasn't done any of the hard work it takes to build ties with the Palestinians over the last few decades. So I don't see them as a reliable interlocutor, or an interlocutor with skin in the game. The people with skin in the game right now are actually the Qataris. And so Qatar has, by the way, at America's request, provided a home base for the leaders of Hamas for several years now. They also did the same with the leaders of the Taliban. And Qatar increasingly sees itself as the Switzerland of the Middle East. And they see it as their role to be everyone's friend, but also a neutral country that is able to arbitrate between warring parties. So over the last few weeks, they played a vital role in negotiating some of the hostage releases, the prisoner exchange between Hamas and Israel. I imagine that they will continue to play an important role in that. I would be very surprised if China will have any role in that process.
When you're bureau chief in Delhi, you might have already covering developments in Bangladesh, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan. These are the countries on which the Chinese shadows are lengthening. Do you think India has reasons to be worried about it?
Of course, India should be very worried about Chinese expansionism in South Asia, for sure, but also across Asia. Any sort of expansion of ties between China and India's neighbors. And by the way, that's been happening for quite a while now. All of that should be worrying for New Delhi, and is reason, I think, for New Delhi to ensure that it is a good neighbor, that it does right by its neighbors, that it builds ties with Dhaka and Colombo and all of the capitals, Male of the region, to ensure that it is first in, to ensure that it is likely to have better relations, better deals than anything China has to offer. I think there's also another area here where India's emergence as a regional power, global power, India's sort of friendship with the United States is useful because it's important for India to be able to show these neighbors that China's model of debt trap diplomacy is not a model that works. It's important for India to be able to show to Colombo, for example, that when you take loans from the Chinese, it backfires. You end up giving away a port like Hambantota. And it's important for India to advocate at the multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the IMF for better loan terms for the likes of Sri Lanka or Bangladesh if it needs it, so that they turn to the multilateral system rather than turning to China. That's very important for the world to do, for the liberal order to do, and for India to play a part in pressuring those countries to do that. So, for example, at COP28, which just concluded, very little debt financing was discussed. But it's very important, I think, for the countries that see themselves as, part of the liberal international rules-based order to create better lending conditions. It is crazy that today Kenya is paying 62 cents out of every dollar it makes on servicing its tax burden. It needs to be able to take out extra loans at cheap rates to be able to effect a green transition. Now, India, if it wants to be a leader in these areas, could be advocating for these very things, not only because it's the right thing to do, but it ensures that these countries don't turn to China instead.
Let us move to Ukraine. 2 years have passed. Are the US and European allies have any clarity about endgame? What's going to happen in Ukraine? 1 year back when Zelensky came, he was received in US like hero. Last week, he was really going around seeking help. And there seemed to be some reservations and some kind of fatigue in the Congress. Republicans perhaps not ready. Europeans also some fatigue. Now, if the American help, though they have been saying we will help you as long as it takes, some mistake may come if the help doesn't come. The resistance from Ukraine will collapse. Do you see any end in the near future? What could be any settlement? Could be any negotiated settlement?
So the Western stance from day one has been that if there is a settlement for Ukraine, the Ukrainians have to ask for it and lead it. And the reason why everyone has been so deferential to Kyiv's point of view is that Ukraine has been incredibly brave in how it has fought this war. Man, woman, and child, everyone seems to be in agreement in Ukraine that they're going to fight to the bitter end. So when you have a situation where you have a country that is so united and so in agreement about fighting back, it's very hard to tell those people to accept a negotiated settlement. You also negotiate from a position of strength. And it's been very unclear at what point Ukraine finds itself in a position of strength. There were moments, for example, a year ago, when it could have negotiated. There was, in fact, a moment in March of 2022 where the two sides were close to a potential agreement. It didn't happen in part because the West also gave Ukraine more weapons, which changed its calculus of its own position of strength and its ability to maybe even win the war. So this is a dynamic that is shifting rapidly, and Kyiv needs to make game time decisions. But I think the West is going to continue to allow it to make that fundamental decision for itself. Now, the American funding part of this debate is very tricky. I think there's immense gridlock in Congress. The fact that the Republicans have tied funding for Ukraine to the border issue is deeply worrying for Zelensky. That's why he went to DC this week, by the way. It's unclear how that gets resolved. I don't know if America will end up being able to give Ukraine the funds it has promised in the past. It will likely find some workarounds, executive orders, and other ways to try and help Ukraine in any way it can. But I think the European will is much more united. And I think Europe is expected to stand up and stand for Ukraine in a way that maybe America hasn't been able to in a united form. And then the other thing, the ticking clock here, is the American election. So I think Putin, for sure, is going to be very unlikely to want any kind of settlement until November of 2024. He is going to hope that Trump wins the election and that when Trump wins, there will be a real boost to illiberalism, to authoritarianism, and that America will just not care about Ukraine, that it won't be able to frame the Russia-Ukraine conflict as a conflict over sovereignty or between democracy and autocracy. So that's Putin's hope. Now, given that Zelensky knows that, he's likely going to have to calculate accordingly. Does he try and go for some sort of a deal before the election if he thinks Trump is going to win? Or if he thinks Biden is going to win, does he put all his chips on that, bide his time until then, and then hope that a re-elected Biden is able to give Ukraine a lot more of what it needs? I mean, this is basically 3D chess at this point. But, left to their own devices, I think the Ukrainians will want to keep fighting.
Let us move to Hamas and Israel conflict. What Hamas did on October 7 was wrong. It was attack, killing 1,200 odd people, taking 220 hostages. It was totally wrong. It must be condemned. But what has Israel done? 18,000, still count, 18,000 people killed in Gaza. 1.8 million people are displaced in the whole country. You simply order, go to south, there's no place to really move, no water, no electricity, all kind of human considerations have been just ignored. And the fact that UN Secretary General has to use discretionary powers, which have never been used the last 50 years, asking for what? For ceasefire. And the US is also now openly saying that this is really not something which you can continue doing. Do you think US is really putting enough pressure on Israel? Or thanks to Israeli lobby in USA, no president really can afford to put more pressure than beyond a limit. And when his elections are due, how can Israel not be advised that there is no military solution to this? For 75 years, they have known they have military superiority. They have defeated Arab countries individually or also group. There is no match. But all this superiority has not brought them the peace and security they want. And somebody had to tell them there is no British solution. What do you?
Yeah, you're right. Look, American foreign policy when it comes to the Middle East has been flawed. And you can now see, given the events of the last 2 months, why America has been trying to pivot away from the Middle East for the better part of 2 decades and focus more on Asia. The Middle East is a very complicated, messy place. When it comes to leverage that this administration has on Israel, it actually has a fair bit of leverage. Biden is now seen as the most popular man in Israel because he stood by the Israelis in their moment of greatest need. He flew to Israel. He was photographed side by side with Netanyahu, who is not popular. And the question then is, at what stage does America use that leverage to try and push Israel to be much, much more cognizant of the damage it's causing in Gaza and to get to the table for a potential two-state solution deal? America's stance has been shifting a little bit over the last few weeks. It is saying slightly tougher things about Israel. Its words cautioning Israel to focus more just on Hamas and to try and be more careful about civilian casualties. It is saying that in public much more than it was before, but it's not enough. Palestinians will say that America could do a lot more, that it could be a lot tougher on Israel. In fact, much of the world, all of the global South, and as you pointed out with the UN resolution vote, most of the world would agree that what is happening in Gaza is awful. The Americans have a very particular appreciation and understanding for how Israel feels. And I want to just explain that for a minute here. Israel was founded to create a homeland for the Jews, to create a place where they felt safe. That sense of safety was just shattered on October 7th. And if you speak to Israelis, they will say that they need to reinstate deterrence. For them to reinstate the concept of deterrence, they need to do awful, crazy things. I'm not saying this is right. I'm explaining to you how the Israelis think. When I recently interviewed Ehud Barak, who is the most decorated Israeli military leader in their history and a former prime minister, I told him that you're going to lose a lot of global public support over what's going to happen in Gaza. And he said, that's fine. We've calculated that. We need to reestablish deterrence. So I'm willing to lose all of that global public support. And his words are not an outlier. I mean, those are the words of how most Israelis and how the Israeli establishment feels. So what Israel is doing in Gaza is what its people want. I think that's an important thing to understand, right or wrong, but it's important to understand that as we try and think about this from a policy perspective. From a policy perspective, the reality is that Israel can't do what it's doing without American support. That if it is not backstopped by two US carriers nearby that are standing by ready to attack if Hezbollah gets involved or if the Houthi situation escalates, America is backstopping Israel with arms, money, and advice. And at some point, President Biden needs to use that leverage to try and get Bibi to the table, to get them to realize that their goal of eliminating Hamas is not really a goal that any other country in the Middle East sees as viable. If you speak to the Qataris, as I did just a few days ago, I was in Doha, and I spoke with the foreign minister and the prime minister there. Their take is that the very idea of eliminating Hamas is laughable. It's not going to happen. They have tens of thousands of fighters. They have people living in Doha who run Hamas. How do you kill them? How do you eliminate Hamas? It's an unachievable goal. And if your goal is unachievable, then how do you end the war? So at some point, very serious discussions need to take place. The longer America takes to have those discussions, the more unpopular it gets globally. So I think Biden's in a very tough spot. He had to stand by Israel in its moment of greatest need, partly because, remember, America also has 7 million Jews, about as many as Israel has. You mentioned the lobbies. Those are, of course, powerful. But now Biden also has to think about the Arab American vote. He also has to think about American foreign policy globally and how unpopular America is becoming because of the fact that we keep seeing these numbers of civilian casualties rise in Gaza. And then finally, as I think Biden would have realized with Zelensky's visit to Washington this week, American policy in the Middle East is not just hurting the Middle East, it is hurting Ukraine as well. Because the longer this war goes on, the harder it is for America not only to fund Ukraine, but to point out that Ukraine is a victim. Because in its stance, if Israel is the victim in the Middle East, then it's harder to get the rest of the world behind how America sees the world. So it's very messy, it's very complicated. And America, again, which has tried to disinvest in the Middle East, is rapidly discovering that it keeps getting dragged in, and it has to come back to a two-state solution, which it has ignored for the better part of 2 decades.
Well, G20 summit hosted by India has been a great success by all accounts. And India has been projecting and advocating the interests of Global South. It also hosted 2 virtual summits of Global South. More than 125 countries participated. Prime Minister Modi has been airing views on this. Do you think India is a natural leader of Global South, or one of the major voices of Global South?
It is certainly one of the major leaders of the Global South. It is a natural leader of the Global South. It is not the only leader, however. I mean, there is also Indonesia, there is also Brazil. There are also smaller countries that have big economies, like Saudi Arabia, for example. So as it is, I mean, the Global South is this big, giant grouping that is cumbersome, that is unwieldy. Many people even criticize the very idea of a Global South. What unites so many countries across so many continents that have more differences than things that unite them. But in as much as it is a group that is able to lobby at international fora for certain things that benefit it. So, for example, at COP, to be able to lobby for loss and damage payments, to be able to negotiate for the scope and scale of those payments to mitigate climate change damage in the Global South. That's important for the Global South to advocate for better financing rates from the big, mostly Western multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. That's a good thing. It's good for the Global South to have that forum to be able to appeal to the West, which still controls the purse strings, to make those appeals to create a more equitable global financing system, a more equitable global environment for investments, for multilateralism, for how the world deals with conflicts, for how the world thinks about pandemics and vaccine equity and all of those issues. I think it's really important that the Global South has found its voice together, that it has built this lobbying kind of group, however imperfect, however heterogeneous this group is. I'm glad that it exists. Now, the question that India will have to grapple with is when the Global South's interests diverge from its own interests, then how does New Delhi handle its sort of primacy within the Global South? I haven't seen too many of those challenges emerge so far, but they will inevitably emerge in the coming years.
India is now the most populous country in the world. It has become the fifth largest economy and tipped to become third largest by another 2 or 3 years. How long can India be kept out of United Nations UN Security Council?
As long as any country on the UNSC has a veto, it'll be very hard to have India join that group. The United Nations was created in 1945 with a snapshot view of the world in 1945. But the world isn't a photograph. The world is like a movie. It's changing with every year, with every decade. And it's a shame that we have a United Nations that is frozen in time in 1945 and is unable to deal with the realities of 2023. And when I say frozen in time, I mean it literally. Like when you have countries with veto power, you have frozen it in time. So I think it's unlikely for India to be able to join as long as China, doesn't want it to join. The bigger issue here, rather than just thinking about India joining a club, is to change the club, is to break the club itself. And I think the United Nations is long overdue for dramatic reforms. This is an incredibly unwieldy body where there are more disagreements than agreements, where on the two biggest issues of the last 22 months, the war in Ukraine and Israel's war in Gaza, the United Nations has had virtually no ability to make big agreements, virtually no ability to influence the outcomes, and a lot of rancor and a lot of divisions. When you think about the United Nations when it comes to climate change, all they do is tell us how bad things are, but they're unable to actually push for positive, tangible solutions. COP28, which ended this week, which is a UN summit, it's crazy that the big accomplishment from this COP was something that has taken 28 COPs to achieve, which is basically to say that we should begin to transition away from fossil fuels, not end fossil fuels, but begin to transition away. 28 years. It took them 28 years to get to that point. So the UN is really, to be frank, not fit for purpose for the way the world is in 2023. The weird thing is that if we had to do it all over again and create a global multilateral institution, we would create the UN once again, but we would likely create in a way that is more equitable. And that's what I think every country needs to really get together and think about. I don't see it happening anytime soon.
BRIC has its report card is really modest achievements. But how come so many countries want to join BRICS? I saw somewhere 35 countries want to join BRICS. Why?
So I'm sure all of you know the origins of BRICS. This was basically a buzzy term that was coined by an investor at Goldman Sachs. I think it was Jim O'Neill. And the point of BRICS was a play on actual bricks and mortar, an actual play on BRICS as a buzzy way to sort of combine Brazil, Russia, India, China, and get countries to invest in those four countries. And this was about I think the early 2000s, before the financial crisis. South Africa joins after, so that there's a presence in Africa. This is a group that has always confounded me. I don't think they have ever achieved anything together. I think they meet each other, but it's full of contradictions. If you imagine the fact that Vladimir Putin couldn't even travel to South Africa for the last summit, because then he would be at risk of, if South Africa was a signatory of the ICC, then they would have to arrest him because of war crimes in Ukraine. So it's a very messy grouping. It's unclear what they actually accomplish. My sense of why they wanted to expand was primarily financial, with the potential Brics Bank, with potential collaboration and strength in numbers. And I think it has more to do with a broader global mood of collaboration in the global South to try and find ways to oppose the collective West when it comes to the very things I was discussing, whether it's financing, lending rates, equity when it comes to vaccines, or other issues, just to create another fora to have those kinds of discussions without the United States dominating things. So that's basically what it is, but I don't think any of us take it very seriously.
Let us go back to where we begin, India-US. Both countries are in for elections next year. How do you see India-US relations next 5 years?
I think this is one of the strongest bilateral relations in the world. I think it is bipartisan in that whether you have a Congress government or a BJP government, whether you have Democrats or Republicans, the trajectory of the US-India relationship, for me, is relatively baked in. And that is because policymakers on both sides seem to have a clear understanding of the shared trajectory of these two countries, the ability for both to cooperate on defense, on technology transfer, on a range of bilateral issues, people-to-people ties. Remember, the Indian American community in America is immensely powerful. They number now upwards of 3 million. Indian Americans are the highest earning income group in the United States, more than any other minority group. So, ties between these two countries have a lot more to do than just who's in power, than the whims of Delhi or Washington. I don't think it's going to change regardless of who wins the election in the United States or who comes to power in India. Although in India's case, I think, we can all make a guess as to who is going to come back to power. So the trajectory remains very strong. That said, there will be bumps along the way. And I think it's important for both sides to recognize that the basis of this relationship is in strategic interest. It is not in values. And the more that they realize that, the cleaner their relationship will become. And I think that's what allowed them to navigate the tensions around the revelations of potential Indian involvement in an assassination plot on a Sikh activist in the United States. The way that was handled quietly at first, and then only revealed when a court was about to make it public. Contrast that with the way in which Canada dealt with the very same issue. Canada, of course, was not able to stop the assassination. After the assassination, they just go public without really trying to back-channel in the same way that the United States back-channeled. And contrast also India's response to Canada. India just dismissed Canada's assertions, didn't even care about it. When Jaishankar, the foreign minister, came to New York and he was asked questions about it, he essentially laughed it off. But similarly, when Indian Foreign Service officers have been asked about the United States case, they've taken it very seriously, very respectfully. They've said they will investigate it. And I think that, again, is a sign of maturity in the relationship. The contrast between the relationship with Canada makes that very clear. So I'm very bullish on the US-India partnership. And I'm also quite pleased to see that they are able to navigate bumps along the way. They are able to define and locate the source of strength of the partnership, which is strategic and not values.
Thank you very much, Ravi. You have been very lucid, very frank, very candid, and I appreciate that. And I was really wondering what we can do. Next 15 minutes, we try to have some questions. We have some of senior most person attending a small group. We have former cabinet secretary there. We have the former foreign secretary there. we have Air Marshal there, we have quite a few secretaries here, and they will certainly have some questions to ask. But first, let me give virtual round of applause to you. You've been wonderful.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure, and thank you for creating a space to
Okay,
have these discussions.
I see Dr. Awad is there from Syria. We have our friend from Rajasthan, Mahind Kawaji, Director General of BSF, former. Now, I'm sure some of you have questions to ask to Ravi Agrawal, and I don't know who wants to go first.
Well, why don't we go to Rajiv
Yes,
Bhatia first, since he had his hand up for quite a while.
Yeah, Rajiv, you want to ask something?
Yes, indeed.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful, thought-provoking and stimulating discussion. I have no preface, only two small questions. One relates to the Quad. You answered beautifully when you said Quad is anti-China club. And obviously it is based on deep interconnection between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Do you feel there is some kind of informal understanding among the four Quad powers about the jurisdictional distribution of responsibilities? Can we say that while all four are responsible for the whole region, India and Australia, maybe with the help of a partner such as France, need to focus on the dynamics and challenges in the Indian Ocean, whereas the US and Japan have to particularly focus on Taiwan and the sea around Japan? So this is one question. And the second question is next December, that is 12 months from now, do you feel both Ukraine and Israel-Gaza conflict will end up in a situation where there's no peace and there's no war? Thank you.
Those are terrific questions. Thank you, sir. On the Quad, my understanding is that that is indeed how they see their regional responsibilities and distribution. I'm very heartened by how often the Quad leaders meet, and it's not just at the highest level, but a lot of readouts I get is that there are constant meetings at the mid-ranking level as well, and between sort of diplomats who really focus on the kinds of issues you just described. My understanding from readouts of those meetings is that that is indeed how they're thinking about distributing responsibility for the region. You mentioned France in there as well, and of course, they're an important part of that sort of set of discussions as well, although they're not part of the Quad. On your question about December next year, as I mentioned about Ukraine, I think it's quite likely that we won't see any real resolution between now and the next US election, so November 2024. I think after that, things could move quickly in either direction. So that is one thing to look out for. A lot will depend on funding, but I won't discount Europe. I think Europe is making a lot of moves to try and shore up Ukraine. And remember, European diplomats right now are extremely worried about the possibility of the return of Trump. There's no other part of the world that is as worried about the return of Trump as Europe. And so just this week, for example, they assembled and they agreed to create a pathway for Ukraine to join the EU. You can expect those meetings and those discussions to accelerate dramatically over the next few months. I believe in the summer, NATO is going to mark its 75th anniversary meeting. And in that meeting, we will likely see more advances for Ukraine to join NATO. For all of those reasons, I don't see Ukraine really rushing to make a negotiated agreement that is disadvantageous to it. I see it waiting until the election. And I certainly see Putin waiting until November 2024. So to answer your question more directly, I think we will be exactly where we are 1 year from now on Ukraine. Israel, Hamas, that is much harder to predict. I do think that the fighting is going to continue for several weeks to come. I think Israel, as I mentioned, needs to reestablish what they think of as deterrence. They're not done yet. There is a chance that this could escalate into a wider war. potentially with Hezbollah in Lebanon. I think that's very unlikely, mostly because Iran doesn't want to waste Hezbollah on this particular conflict right now. They want to drag it out, and they also like seeing Israel lose global public support. But assuming then that the fighting ends at some point in the next 2 to 3 months, the question is what happens next? A lot will depend on the United States. The United States will need to take a much more proactive role in forcing Israel to look at the concerns of the rest of the world and then beginning to create a path forward for Israel without Bibi Netanyahu and to begin to think about who leads the Palestinian people. It's not going to be Hamas. The Palestinian Authority is entirely discredited. Any group that comes to power off the back of this, maybe off the back of American support or brokering, is not going to have legitimacy. So really tough questions need to be asked. I don't think we'll see a resolution by this time next year, to answer your question, but I do think, unlike Ukraine, things will look quite different. There will be movement, and I really, really hope there won't be fighting at this point next year.
Ravi, we have here our friend Dr. Awad, who has spent lifetime studying the Arab-Israeli conflict. Dr. Awad, not a question, but would you like to make very, very brief comment?
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Surinder, and thanks, Ravi, for quite listening to your insight discussion and in-depth analysis. What might take me by surprise is that the American public resentment against the war in Gaza is been increasing, despite the fact that the United States, the government, is still full supporting Israel. And also backdoors that we can see the American are resenting about the Israeli cabinet, especially the two ministers, the interior minister and the defense minister, who has been causing a trouble and changing the American plan of a two-state solution. That's what is worrying. That's why they were calling for restructuring of the cabinet, but Netanyahu will not be in a position to do that. So my question is, if the American public opinion is rising against this war, and the credibility of the United States in the region has been also declining, because you are no more a peace broker, by the way. So if also the American, Ravi, is already agreeing that they have been Israeli using indiscriminate firing, but the American guided missiles, more than 45% of the American guided missiles has been fired, dropped in Gaza indiscriminately, which means you are killing the maximum number of civilians. So why keep denying that civilians are dying and you're telling them to reduce the killing of civilians? I think there is a rift, and we have to acknowledge that rift between the current Israeli government and the current White House runners. So how do you see the American public opinion will build up in changing the perception of the war? Because there is no question that there is a winner outcome of this war by either side. Because now Jack Sullivan is in the region, and the worries for us is that Israel is dragging the United States into a wider conflict, which is involving Hezbollah, involving Iran, involving the Houthis, the Syrian, the Jordanian, the Egyptian. So does the United States prepare for another conflict zone in this area, or they're just happy with the way Israel is carrying on its own carnage against the Palestinians? Thank you.
Okay, Ravi, you want to respond?
Yeah, that's a terrific set of comments and questions. And Dr. Awad, it's nice to see you after so many years from our time at the FCC in Delhi. All of the points you raise are great. You were referring to the Washington Post reporting this week about how nearly half of Israel's bombardment of Gaza was not precision munitions. They were actually what are called dumb missiles, which might explain the very high casualty rate in the region. To your point about the American public mood, there is certainly a shift. There is certainly a rising tide of awareness of the civilian casualty in Gaza and of sympathy for the Palestinian people. However, were you to poll the United States, so among Republican voters, there's dramatic support for Israel over the Palestinians. Something like 69% of Republican voters feel like they need to back Israel come what may, no matter the images that are emerging out of Gaza. Support among Democrats is lower, but that was to be expected. I think the bigger disconnect is not just political or partisan, it is age. So if you look at younger Americans are much more likely to be much more aware of what's going on in Gaza and to question America's longstanding support of Israeli policy. Older Americans who have more historic memory of the Holocaust, for example, are less likely to be swayed by what you're describing. I think either way, the Biden administration is deeply aware. They see themselves as really stuck in a bind. They do realize that they needed to stand by Israel in the beginning, and they do realize that now they are losing a lot of Arab American voters, a lot of potentially young voters, and a lot of Black voters as well, who seek solidarity in other oppressed people around the world. So this is a real problem for the United States. I think it is going to end up shifting policy a bit, but not dramatically. I think Biden, and you have to understand how Biden comes at this as well. This is a man who's 81. This is a man who, all his life has seen himself as Israel's best friend. It's going to be very hard for him to reverse that. And I think for policymakers who work for him, it's important for them to convince him that the best form of friendship is tough love. For the White House to be able to see that their policies with Israel right now are going to backfire, not only for America, but also for Israel, and of course for the region. No one wants to see this become a bigger war. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I also share all of your worries. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I really hope that the United States changes its tack, that it is much tougher, and that they see and react to the news and reporting that shows that Israel really could have done a lot more to prevent civilian casualties. We now know that it hasn't done enough.
Before we close, I must welcome and also greet my friend, Dr. Dennis Jorgens. He joined from Intel's house, Chicago University. This must be early morning there. For your sake, Ravi, he has joined. We have very senior persons here. I don't know whether Ambassador Krishnan Rana, you want to ask anything or make any comment? Ambassador Rana? No, I think he's perhaps left. Well, thank you very much to spare time to be with us on this program. It's always great to meet you, to listen to you, and getting some clarity. These are difficult times. All governments are jostling to find answers, and I'm sure so many shifts are taking place. And election time is a difficult time for any government to make drastic shifts because they can cost votes. Thank you very much. And if you happen to be in Delhi, do let me know. Let me wish you in advance Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and many, many more successes for you in 2024. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. Please keep reading Foreign Policy, and I will be in Delhi during the Raisina dialogue. So I hope I get a chance to see you all then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Thank you. Ambassador. Bye-bye.